Okay, setting aside the issue of the apparent irrelevance of the distinction between non-resistant and resistant non-belief, I think we can note one more curious feature of the divine hiddenness argument. The argument, via premise 2, attempts to tie the very concept of God to the possibility of belief or non-belief in God. Right? The argument implies that a particular act of conception of the human intellect, the concept of non-resistantly not believing in God, is only contingently possible. It is actually possible only if God does not exist, right? And impossible if God does exist. In other words, the argument is based on the claim that if we can conceive of non-resistant non-belief as a real possibility, as something that is intrinsically possible, that may actually occur in reality, then this very conceivability of non-resistant non-belief entails the conclusion that God does not exist. So, Alex's argument, it turns out, interestingly enough, seems to be rather like the famous ontological argument for God's existence. According to the ontological argument, the very concept of God can be used to prove the existence of God. According to Alex's divine hiddenness argument, the very concept of non-resistant non-belief, the fact that non-resistant non-belief is not inconceivable, that it is a self-consistent concept, can be used to prove the non-existence of God. I think. Well, the major difference between the two arguments is just that the ontological argument has some plausibility. Alex's argument, in contrast, has none. Right? The claim that the conceivability of non-resistant non-belief in God is dependent on the truth of atheism is just silly. It implies that part of the definition of God, of the God concept, is that God is a being who can't or couldn't or wouldn't stand to permit the existence of non-resistant non-belief, right? Or that God is a being who is necessarily a being who would only allow non-belief to exist insofar as it is a punishment from him. And most importantly, non-belief in God exists only as God's punishment for non-belief in God. Like, what? Now, if Alex really wants to defend such a conception of God, he's free to do so, right? Have at it, Alex. But regardless, that concept of God is a novel and bizarrely idiosyncratic one in the history of philosophy and theology. And ordinary theists will be happy to join Alex in not believing in a God of that sort, right? In a God thus defined, who is incompatible with non-resistant non-belief in him. Right? Now, of course, to be fair, what atheistic Alex was probably thinking was not that any historic believer in God had ever actually believed in the God thus defined and refuted. What he was thinking was that he, the clever Alex, following in the clever footsteps of Schellenberg, had noticed something that believers in God throughout history, and especially the Christians, had failed to notice, but nonetheless were logically committed to, despite their consistently failing to notice the fact. But Alex, with Schellenberg, is pretty clearly mistaken. As far as I can see, the false god he attempts to foist on us is pretty clearly a straw god, an idol of his mind, a figment of his own resistant to belief in God fancy. Right? So, but wait. Isn't Alex a non-resistant non-believer? So this question brings us to premise 3, right? And Alex's claim that he, Alex the atheist, is a paradigm case of non-resistant non-belief. This is the most emphatically and dramatically pleaded part of Alex's case, and I'm guessing in hindsight, from the perspective of agnostic Alex, and probably also the most embarrassingly cringeworthy for him. So let's look at it. Now, so far I've argued for the falsity of premise 2, namely the alleged incompatibility of the existence of a loving God with the existence of non-resistant non-belief. So even if Alex is a case of non-resistant non-belief, it follows only that Alex's fancifully contrived God does not exist, not that the standard God of theism, and in particular the God of Orthodox Christian theology, doesn't exist. But I think Alex's less obviously absurd claim that he is a real case of non-resistant, of a non-resistant non-believer, can also be shown to be gratuitous, and unsustainable. He leads off his plaidoyer, pardon my French, with an actually interesting claim. He says, quote, "You cannot know my heart. You cannot know if I am as non-resistant as I claim. But I hope that my actions here might betray me." End quote. Now, I think this claim is interesting in some ways that Alex probably didn't notice. To begin with, I think his actions do betray him. I think they betray that he likely is much more a case of resistant non-belief than he claims to be. It seems obvious, actually, that we can know that he is not as non-resistant as he claims. And how non-resistant is that? Well, to be clear, it seems he actually claims to be non-resistant simpliciter. He claims to be a paradigm case of non-resistant. And yet we know he is not non-resistant, because his manifest actions, i.e. his arguments, insofar as they are manifestly laid before us, indeed uniformly betray resistance. Do they not? Right? Moreover, the details of his personal intellectual itinerary, the intellectual CV that he gives us, would seem to cast a grave pall of suspicion over any claim that he could be merely an innocent, non-resistant, non-believer. Why? In short, because, given all he has read, he ought to know better than to advance the clearly silly, or at best hopelessly contentious, arguments that he advances, as if these were in fact logically compelling arguments. To anyone who doesn't have the excuse of sheer ignorance, of innocent naivete, it should be entirely obvious that these arguments are not compelling, I think. Nonetheless, Alex thinks otherwise. He may be resistant, but if so, it appears he is blind to his own resistance. As Jesus comments in the Gospel, seeing they see, but fail to perceive. Hearing they hear, but fail to understand. So, let's look at his claim. What is his case for his being a bona fide non-resistant non-believer? He gives us a veritable litany of what he takes to be the credentials establishing the bona fides for the non-resistant nature of his non-belief. Being something of a reader myself, I have a PhD in philosophy. I was most struck by his claims to have read Athanasius, Anselm, Augustine, Aquinas, Julian of Norwich, Catherine of Siena, Durkheim, Marx, Freud, Jung, James, Fraser, Craig, Murray, Swinburne, blending of poetry, Job, Psalms, Ecclesiastes, Dostoevsky, C.S. Lewis, the Gospels. Not only all that, but Alex notes that he even listened to some worship music, right? So just imagine an atheist listening to worship music, right? Now, what more proof of non-resistant non-belief could anyone possibly ask for? Really. And he concludes in grandiose fashion, "I even got an actual degree in theology from a university, and nothing, not once, not nearly, not ever, not even briefly, have I experienced anything that speaks to the existence of a God in the universe." Now, if that doesn't blow your little God-believing theist mind, all right? Wow. But seriously, the really obvious question, Alex, to be asked in the face of such a claim is, how do you know that you haven't experienced anything that speaks to the existence of a God in the universe? Alex is making such a claim necessarily presupposes that he is in possession of some objective criterion for recognizing when an experience speaks to the existence of God and when it does not. The fact, however, that he omits to mention or to describe what that criterion is makes me think that he, in fact, is not in possession of any such criterion. And if that is the case, then it follows that his claim is merely begging the question. Indeed, for all Alex knows, every bit of his experience might be speaking to him of the existence of God, despite the fact that he, the resistant non-believer, who is in denial about his resistance, fails to recognize it. That might sound like an odd claim, but consider an analogous case, a dispute between, say, Alex and Frida about the reality of free will. Now, if Alex argues against the reality of free will, that free will is an illusion or delusion, Frida, who believes in free will, can't refute Alex just by appealing to her experience. Right? Frida can't say, regardless of the arguments for or against, I know there is free will because I have free will, and I know it because I personally experience it. Frida, in this case, would be just missing the point and begging the question, because Alex is precisely advancing the claim that Frida's personal everyday experience vis-a-vis free will is illusory or delusory. Right? It's based on a mistake. Frida experiences freedom of will, but Alex claims that such experience may well be real as a subjective experience, but nonetheless it is based on a misunderstanding or misinterpretation of the reality that is experienced. Frida says, I feel like I experience freedom, therefore I am free. But Alex quite rightly retorts, well, sorry, Frida, but you're missing the point. That doesn't follow. So the same applies to Alex when he claims that nothing in his experience speaks to the existence of God. That is evidently his subjective interpretation of his own experience, but the question is precisely whether that interpretation is correct. I won't go further into it here, but I will just suggest that a fundamental problem for Alex is that he seems to have a naive and clearly mistaken understanding of the fundamental relationship between experience on the one hand, and concepts and arguments and understanding, reason, truth, knowledge, etc. on the other. So to conclude, I think I want to add a final caveat. I've been taking Alex at his word that his divine hiddenness argument was meant to be compelling. I think, in fact, it's quite possible that Alex likes to fudge things, rhetorically speaking, and that he really just meant that he hoped people would be convinced by his arguments, regardless of their perhaps glaring logical deficiencies. That is to say, perhaps Alex isn't as naive about the nature of arguments and sound logic as I've made out here. Maybe, in fact, he's just a wee bit dishonest. Right? I honestly don't know the answer to that one, but it seems possible, doesn't it? And one more concluding note. In the video I've discussed, Alex proposed to explain why he doesn't believe in God. His assumption there is that he indeed knows why he doesn't believe in God, and that his reason for not believing is precisely the collection of obviously bad arguments that he recites to his audience and to himself in that video. In fact, however, Alex might do well to ask himself a serious question here. Is it possible that, just as he doesn't really know whether God exists or not, and hence his retreat from atheism to agnosticism, he also doesn't really know why he doesn't believe in God? Right? He also doesn't really know why he doesn't believe in God. Right? There's giving reasons, and then there's rationalization. There's telling a story, and then there's confabulation. There's telling the truth, and then there's saying whatever seems to serve the purpose of self-justification. In reality, it can be virtually impossible to differentiate between these alternatives with any certainty. The genuine article from the false imitation, a sound argument from mere sophistry. If Alex were to look at it honestly, I think he would recognize that just as the truth about God is hidden to him, the real truth about his own self, the fundamental bases of his own being and thinking and acting, is likewise hidden to him. If that is the case, then it might strike us that there's a significant parallelism between these two instances of hiddenness, the hiddenness of God and the hiddenness of one's own deepest self. And I would suggest to Alex that he consider the possibility that this parallelism is no coincidence.